The scent of sawdust and old varnish is my church. It's the only place the world makes sense. A sanctuary built of cedar beams and quiet truths. My workshop. For 50 years, this dusty, sun-drenched space has been my confessional, my therapist's office, and the one place on God's green earth where I am in complete control. I was running a piece of Ohio black walnut over the joiner, the blade singing its high, clean song as it shaved the wood to a perfect smoothness. I was lost in the rhythm, feeling the grain give way to the steel, when a small shadow fell across the workbench, eclipsing the afternoon light. It was my grandson, Leo, 8 years old, with my late wife's serious eyes. Eyes that always seemed to see the things adults tried to hide. He crept in, quiet as a mouse in a sawmill, his sneakers making no sound on the concrete floor. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the hum of the machine. I hit the kill switch. The abrupt silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum that seemed to pull all the air from the room. He tugged on the sleeve of my old flannel shirt, the one with the worn-out elbows. "Grandpa," he said again, a little louder this time, his voice trembling. "Tonight, my mom and dad are going to take your money." The words didn't just hang in the air. They crashed. Take my money. Not ask for it, not talk about it, take it. As if it were already theirs for the picking. My chest didn't tighten with surprise. No, surprise is a luxury I haven't been able to afford for some time now. It tightened with a cold, hard confirmation, the kind of certainty you feel when you tap a wall and find it hollow. I'd seen the storm clouds gathering for months, watched the barometer of their greed drop lower and lower, but hearing the thunder from the mouth of a child? It changes the very nature of the storm. I knelt down, my old knees cracking a loud protest that echoed in the quiet shop. I looked him right in his serious little eyes, seeing the fear and confusion warring there. "Thank you for telling me, Leo," I said, my voice steady. "You are a brave, good boy, braver than you know." I told him he must never, ever repeat what he heard to anyone. It was our secret now, a heavy, ugly secret for a boy his age to carry. But I knew he could. He had a spine made of the same steel that ran through his great-grandfather. He nodded solemnly, then scurried out as quietly as he came, leaving me alone with the silence and the smell of freshly cut wood.
And I kept that promise. After 15 years of saving, I had enough. I walked off that foundry floor for the last time, took a deep breath of clean air, and never looked back. I started my own custom cabinetry business right here in this workshop with a set of secondhand tools and a fire in my belly. I built it from the ground up, with my own 2 hands, my own sweat. I married a good woman, Martha, God rest her soul. And together, we raised our son, Kevin. I gave him everything I never had. A college education, without a single penny of student debt. The down payment on his first house. A life where the hardest thing he ever had to lift was his briefcase. I wanted him to be better than me, smarter, to reach for things I couldn't even see. And he was smart, sharp as a tack, charming, always knew how to win people over. For a long, long time, I was so proud, it made my chest ache. I thought I had succeeded. I thought I'd broken the cycle of hard labor and quiet uncertainty. I'd given him a foundation of solid steel, a life built on my sacrifices. But you can't control what someone else builds on the foundation you give them. A foundation is just the start. It's the choices they make, the materials they use, that determine if the house will stand firm or crumble in the first strong wind. And my son's biggest choice, the one that changed the entire blueprint of his life, was Tiffany. She was polished, educated, with a smile that could sell ice in a blizzard. But her eyes were always calculating, always looking for the next angle, the next upgrade. She didn't see a family. She saw a network. She didn't see a father-in-law. She saw an asset. I gave him a foundation of steel, but he chose to build his life on sand. And then he met Tiffany, and that's when everything started to rust. The change was subtle at first, like the slow, almost imperceptible shift in the seasons. Little things. Family dinners at my house, a Sunday tradition Martha and I had started when Kevin was just a boy, slowly morphed into comfortable gatherings into something else. They became strategy sessions disguised as casual conversation. It always started with Tiffany. She was a master of her craft, I'll give her that. She could slide a knife between your ribs so smoothly, you'd thank her for the breeze. Art, she'd say, placing a perfectly manicured hand on my arm, her rings cool against my skin. We were just talking about our own legacy planning, and it made us think of you. You've worked so incredibly hard for all this. Her voice would drop to a conspiratorial whisper. You shouldn't have to worry about the stress of managing it all in your retirement. You should be enjoying yourself. I'd just smile, a tight, polite smile, and tell her I enjoyed keeping my mind busy, that the stress was what kept me sharp. But she was persistent. A leaky faucet. Drip, drip, drip. Soon Kevin started parroting her lines, his voice lacking her finesse, sounding hollow and rehearsed. Dad, Tiffany has a point. You know, the market is so volatile. Why don't I help you consolidate your accounts? We could get my name on them just to make things easier if, anything happens. He'd let the sentence hang there, the unspoken words, if you get sick, if you lose your mind, if you die, festering in the air between us. They wrapped their greed in the pretty floral wrapping paper of concern. But I could see right through it. I'm a woodworker. I know the difference between solid oak and cheap, flimsy veneer. And their concern was the thinnest veneer I'd ever seen. The real shift, the moment I knew this wasn't just casual greed, but a concerted campaign, came about 6 months ago. Tiffany started leaving things around my house. Accidentally, of course. The first time it was a brochure for a high-end assisted living facility called Golden Horizons, left on the coffee table. It featured smiling, silver-haired seniors playing shuffleboard. Oh my goodness, she chirped, snatching it up with a theatrical gasp. That's for my great-aunt Mildred. I must have dropped it. A week later, it was a magazine left open on my kitchen counter, the page dog-eared. The article was titled, Is Your Aging Parents' Home Becoming a Hazard? The Hidden Dangers of Living Alone. They were planting seeds, trying to build a narrative, not for me, but for others, for their friends, for doctors, for anyone who would listen, that I was old, incapable, a burden. The final straw, the one that broke the camel's back, was when she brought up selling the house. It was a perfect summer evening. We were in the backyard watching Leo play on the swing set I'd built for him with my own hands. She said, "You know, Art, this is a lot of house for one person. The property taxes alone must be a killer. You could sell it, move into a nice modern condo, and have a huge nest egg to travel the world with. No more mowing the lawn, no more worrying about a leaky roof." She said it with that dazzling 1,000-watt smile, as if she were offering me the keys to paradise. But what I heard was, "Give us our inheritance now. Get out of our way. Your life is an inconvenience to our financial planning." She wasn't just talking about a house. She was talking about dismantling my life, tearing down the home where I raised my son, where I loved my wife, where every nail and floorboard held a memory I cherished. That night, long after they had gone, I sat in the dark, staring at a glossy brochure for a place called Sunset Villas. I didn't just listen to my gut. I made a phone call. A phone call to a lawyer named Sarah Jenkins that would end up saving everything I ever built. A week after my first quiet meeting with Sarah Jenkins, the next attack came, and this one was different. It was cleverer, more insidious, and far, far crueler. It was a Tuesday morning, bright and sunny. I was in my kitchen, enjoying a cup of coffee and reading the paper, when there was a knock at the door. It wasn't the friendly rap of a neighbor or the thud of a delivery man. It was a firm, official knock, the kind that makes the coffee in your cup tremble. I opened the door to find a man and a woman in professional, nondescript attire. They held out their IDs. They were caseworkers from Adult Protective Services, APS. My heart didn't just drop to the floor, it plummeted. The woman, whose name was Ms. Albright, spoke in a calm, practiced tone that did nothing to soothe the sudden ice in my veins. They'd received an anonymous call, she explained, from a concerned neighbor. The caller claimed I was showing signs of self-neglect and cognitive decline. The words were clinical, sterile, but they felt like punches. The caller claimed I was forgetting to eat, that the house was in disarray, and that I might no longer be fit to manage my own affairs.
It was a lie. A disgusting, calculated, venomous lie. And I knew, with a certainty that was as absolute as the sunrise, exactly who was behind it. Tiffany. She had become quite friendly with Brenda Gable from 2 houses down. They were in the same book club, or so Tiffany claimed. I'd seen them talking over the fence just a few days earlier, their heads close together, Tiffany's hand on Brenda's arm, her face a mask of earnest concern. I could almost hear the conversation, Tiffany's voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I'm just so worried about Art, Brenda. He's all alone over there, and he seems so forgetful lately." She had weaponized a neighbor. She had turned a community into a tool for her own greed. The next hour was, without question, one of the most humiliating of my entire life. I, Arthur Miller, a man who built a business from nothing, who managed payrolls and investments and complex projects for 40 years, had to prove I was sane to 2 complete strangers in my own home. I had to let them inspect my life as if it were a crime scene. They looked in my refrigerator, their eyes scanning for spoiled food. They checked the expiration dates on my milk and my bread. They asked me who the president was. They asked me what year it was. They asked me to count backward from 100 by 7s. I did it all. I answered their questions with a calm, steady voice, but inside, a fire of pure, cold rage was building. This wasn't about my well-being. This was a strategic, legal move. They were trying to build a case against me, to have me declared incompetent by the state. It was a chess move,
designed to discredit me, to make any future resistance on my part look like the paranoid ramblings of a senile old man. They left, of course, noting in their official report that the claim was unfounded. The house was spotless. My mind was, in their words, sharp as a tack. But the damage was done. The humiliation lingered like a bad smell. The seed of doubt had been planted in an official government record. They weren't just after my money anymore. They were after my mind, my autonomy, my dignity. I shut the door behind them, and I leaned against it, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so profound it felt like a physical force. Now, I have to ask you, what would you have done in my shoes? How would you react if your own child, your own flesh and blood, tried to pull a stunt like this? Let me know in the comments because I truly want to know. This was the moment I realized I couldn't just defend. I couldn't just build walls. I had to set a trap. They thought they had wounded me. They had no idea they had just handed me all the ammunition I would ever need. The very next morning, I was sitting in Sarah Jenkins' office, a file from APS clutched in my hand. I didn't need to say much. I just slid the unfounded report across her polished mahogany desk. She read it, her expression shifting from professional concern to something harder, something I recognized from my days in the mill, forged steel. "They've declared war, Art," she said, her voice low and even, devoid of any pity, which I appreciated. "They've made a formal move to establish you as unfit. They're building a paper trail. So today, we build a fortress, an impregnable one." And that's exactly what we did. For the next 4 hours, we worked. Sarah wasn't just a lawyer. She was an architect, and the law was her building material. We didn't just draft a document. We forged a shield. We created an ironclad, irrevocable living trust. She explained it to me in simple, direct terms. She said, "Think of it like this, Art. We're creating a legal box. We're going to put all your most valuable assets, the house, your investment portfolio, your savings, inside the box. You will be the trustee, which means you have the only key. You can do anything you want with what's inside the box. Sell it, spend it, give it away. But technically, your name is no longer on the assets. The box's name is. The trust's name." This single elegant move made any power of attorney they might trick me into signing almost completely worthless. They could get power over me, but not over the trust. The trust had its own rules, locked in place, unchangeable by anyone but me, the trustee. Trying to use a power of attorney to access the trust's assets would be like trying to open a bank vault with a library card. It just simply wouldn't work. But Sarah, she was brilliant. She didn't stop there. She said, "Now for the security system. We need to add a poison pill, a self-destruct button for their greed." She drafted a special clause, and we called it the Poison Interference Clause. It was a beautiful, lethal piece of legal work. It stated, in cold, clear, unambiguous language, that any attempt by any named beneficiary, namely Kevin, to challenge the trust, to attempt to remove me as trustee through legal action, or to gain control of my assets through coercion, legal maneuvering, or by having me declared incapacitated by the state, would result in the immediate, automatic, and permanent disinheritance of that beneficiary. It was a mousetrap set in plain sight, and the bait was my entire estate. If they touched it, if they even tried to touch it in the wrong way, the trap would spring, and they would be left with absolutely nothing, not a penny, not a single nail from the house I built. I signed the papers. My signature was firm, without a hint of a tremor. Sarah notarized them, her stamp coming down on the paper with a satisfying thud. She sent secure, certified copies to be filed with the county clerk and with the legal departments of all my financial institutions. It was done. The legal walls were up, the cannons were loaded and aimed at the gate. All I had to do was wait for the enemy to appear on the horizon.
Sarah filed the papers that afternoon. The fortress was built, the trap was set. All I had to do was wait for them to walk into it. I just didn't realize they'd try to burn the house down first. Before the final confrontation, before the dramatic showdown I knew was coming, there was one more betrayal. It was a smaller one, perhaps, a quieter one, but in many ways, it was the one that hurt the most. It was the one that finally severed the last frayed thread of hope I had for my son. It came from Kevin, alone. A few days after the trust was finalized and the papers were filed, he showed up at the house on a Wednesday afternoon. This was highly unusual. He never came by during the week. He was always too slammed at work. He arrived bearing a box of donuts from the Good Bakery downtown and a strained, artificial smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Dad! I felt bad about how stressed you've been lately. Tiffany and I were talking, and we think maybe we've been pushing too hard. I just wanted to come by and help out. Maybe I could help you organize your office. It's always so cluttered in there. It would be my pleasure."
My internal alarm bells weren't just ringing, they were screaming, a deafening siren in my head. Kevin had never offered to organize anything in his entire 38 years of life. His childhood bedroom looked like a tornado had hit a thrift store. But I played along. I had to see how far he would go. "That's very thoughtful of you, son," I said, my voice heavy with a weariness that wasn't entirely faked. I led him to my small home office, the one where I keep my files, my business records, my entire life on paper. I told him I was going to work on sanding a cabinet door in the garage for a bit and left him to it. But I didn't go to the garage. I went to the kitchen, which shares a wall with the office. I sat at the kitchen table, silent, and watched the reflection of the office in the dark glass of the oven door. It was a distorted, warped view, but it was clear enough. He didn't organize. He searched. He moved with a quiet, methodical urgency, opening file cabinet drawers, shuffling through papers, his eyes scanning everything. He wasn't cleaning. He was hunting. He was looking for my will, my bank statements, my investment portfolio. He was taking inventory. He was assessing the prize before the heist. The worst moment, the one that felt like a physical blow, came when I saw him walk over to my old oak desk. It was the first piece of furniture I ever built. He gently pulled on the top right drawer. It was locked. It's where I've always kept my most important personal documents and the key to my small fireproof safe. I saw his shoulders slump in frustration. Then I saw him reach into his wallet and pull out a credit card. He knelt down, trying to slide it into the crack to jimmy the lock, his back to the door. That was it. I couldn't watch anymore. The sight of my son trying to pick the lock on my desk like a common burglar broke something inside me. I stood up and walked back into the office. The sound of my footsteps on the hardwood floor made him jump, and he shoved the credit card back in his pocket, a flush of guilt coloring his neck. "Just trying to straighten these files," he stammered, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured vaguely at a pile of papers. "Finding a lot of old stuff in here." I just looked at him. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse him. I just looked at him with all the pain and disappointment a father can feel. He looked me in the eye and lied. And in that moment, the son I had raised, the boy I had taught to ride a bike and bait a hook, was gone. In his place was a stranger, a thief wearing his face. And I knew the final confrontation was no longer weeks away. It was hours. The final act of this sorry play began with that desperate, prophetic whisper from Leo in the workshop. "Tonight." The word echoed in my head, a single ominous drumbeat. After Kevin's pathetic attempt at burglary, I knew their patience had run out. They were desperate. They had tried to discredit me with the state, and it had failed spectacularly. They had tried to steal my private documents, and they had been caught red-handed. Now there was only one move left for them. A direct assault, a full frontal attack armed with legal papers and sugar-coated lies. And I was ready to let them in. In fact, I was going to invite them in. My performance had to be perfect. Every word, every pause, every sigh had to be believable. Around 7 p.m. that evening, I made the call.
I dialed Kevin's number, deliberately letting my hand tremble just enough to make my voice sound shaky and thin when I brought the receiver to my ear. "Kevin," I said, my voice a frail imitation of its usual strength, barely above a whisper. "Kevin, it's Dad." I paused, letting out a long, weary sigh that I'd been practicing. "Son, I think you and Tiffany are right." I could almost hear the silence on the other end of the line, the sound of gears turning in his head, of disbelief warring with triumphant excitement. "Dad? Are you okay? You sound tired." "I am tired, son. I'm so tired. That visit from those people from the state the other day, it took a lot more out of me than I let on. And then with you trying to help and me being so stubborn and proud, I'm done fighting." I let the sentence hang there, the bait glittering in the dark water. He bit hard. "Oh, Dad, we're so glad to hear you say that. We were just worried about you. That's all this has ever been about. We can come over right now. We actually have some paperwork ready that will simplify everything, just like we talked about. It'll take all the pressure right off you." The relief in his voice was palpable. He thought he had won. "Yes," I whispered, as if the word itself was an effort. "Take the pressure off. That sounds good. We'll be there in 20 minutes, Dad. Don't you worry about a thing. Just sit tight. We'll handle everything from here on out." He hung up, and I know that in his mind, the victory was already his. The champagne was already on ice. They were coming over to claim their prize, to watch the old king finally abdicate his throne. They would walk in expecting a meek surrender. They were about to walk into a meticulously planned ambush. I walked slowly to my dining room table, the one I'd built for Martha as a wedding gift 50 years ago. I placed an old, worn-out fountain pen, my father's pen, next to an empty space on the polished wood. I pulled out a chair, sat down, and folded my hands. And then I waited. The curtain was about to rise on the final act. They thought they had me right where they wanted me. Old, confused, and defeated after their relentless attacks. What they didn't know was that my part in this play was just beginning. The headlights of their Lexus swept across the living room window precisely 19 minutes later. They were punctual, I'll give them that. Punctual and predictable. The sound of their car doors shutting in the quiet evening air had a finality to it, like the closing of a coffin lid. I remained seated at the dining room table, the back to the front door, my hands folded calmly on the wood. I listened. I heard the familiar sound of the key in the lock, the key that I had given them years ago, a symbol of a trust they had so thoroughly corroded it had turned to dust.
The door opened. There was no, "Hi, Dad, how are you?" No warmth, no pretense of familial affection, just the cold calculus of their purpose. "We're here, Art," Tiffany announced, her voice a little too bright, a little too brittle. It sliced through the quiet of my home. I turned slowly in my chair, making a show of how much effort it took, my joints supposedly stiff and old. Kevin was standing behind her, holding a sleek black leather briefcase like a soldier holding his weapon. Tiffany had a crisp manila envelope clutched in her hand. Her face was arranged in a perfect mask of loving, daughterly concern. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. It was the face of a predator that smiles. "Let's make this quick and easy for your sake," she said, gliding over to the table. She moved with a liquid grace, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She placed the envelope on the table with a soft, definitive thud. No need to drag it out. I shuffled over to my designated chair, my hand on my lower back, each step a carefully choreographed piece of theater. Old, tired, beaten. I had to sell it. My entire life's work, and more importantly, Leo's future, depended on this performance. They sat down opposite me, the polished oak of the cable I built with my own hands stretching between us like a battlefield. They didn't notice the irony, of course. To them, it was just a table, a thing, an asset, like everything else in the house. Like me. Kevin opened his briefcase and pulled out his laptop, a stark piece of modern machinery on the warm, aged wood.
He was all business, his face set in serious, important lines. Tiffany slid the manila envelope across the table until it stopped right in front of me, perfectly centered. Her smile was dazzling, a perfect white plastic smile that didn't touch her cold, calculating eyes. "Everything is prepared," she said sweetly, her voice like honey mixed with arsenic. "We had our lawyer, a top man in estate planning, draft everything to make it as simple as possible. It will be painless." That word again, painless, as if they were performing a mercy killing, not a hostile takeover, as if gutting a man of his legacy, his history, his very autonomy was a favor. I looked down at the envelope, then back up at their eager, hungry faces, illuminated by the cold blue light of the laptop screen. They looked like wolves who had finally cornered their prey. Little did she know, I had a surprise prepared too, and it would be anything but painless for them. Kevin flipped open his laptop, and the screen cast a cold blue light on his face, erasing any trace of the son I once knew and replacing him with a stranger in a suit. "Okay, Dad," he began, his voice taking on the smooth, confident tone of a salesman closing a deal he knows is in the bag. "We've set up a new consolidated account under a family management structure. It's much more efficient for investment purposes and, more importantly, for tax purposes." He started throwing terms around like probate avoidance, asset allocation, diversified portfolio, and step up in basis. He spoke them as if they were magical incantations, complex words that an old woodworker like me couldn't possibly comprehend. He was trying to overwhelm me, to make me feel small and ignorant, to make me grateful that he, the expert, was stepping in. While he droned on about yields and risk management, Tiffany gently tapped the manila envelope with a perfectly manicured finger. "And these are just the supplementary documents to facilitate that, Art. Just the basics, really. A durable power of attorney and a few account access forms. It just gives us the legal ability to pay your bills for you, to handle the paperwork, so you can finally relax. You've earned it, Art. You really have." Basics. The word was a profound insult. The documents in that envelope were the legal equivalent of a guillotine, and my signature was the rope. The durable power of attorney wasn't just for paying the electric bill. It would give them the power to sell my house out from under me, to liquidate my stocks, to drain my accounts, all with my supposed legal blessing. They weren't helping. They were hijacking my life. I nodded slowly, my eyes glazed over, pretending to be lost in the fog of their explanations, a confused old man grateful for the intervention of his brilliant children. But in my mind, I was crystal clear. I'd read an early draft of these very papers. I found it in the recycling bin a few weeks ago after they'd visited, a crumpled testament to their premeditation. I knew every treacherous clause, every carefully worded trap designed to look like a safety net. Kevin finished his presentation with a flourish, closing his laptop with a soft click. "So, as you can see, Dad, this is really the best thing for everyone. It protects your legacy and takes all the stress right off your plate. We'll take care of everything from now on," Tiffany added, her voice a soothing purr. She pushed the envelope a final inch toward me and then slid a sleek, expensive-looking fountain pen next to it, the kind a man uses to sign away his life. I looked at the pen, I looked at their expectant faces, and then I looked over their shoulders toward the living room doorway. Leo was standing there, a small, silent sentinel in his blue pajamas, his eyes wide with a fear and confusion he didn't fully understand. Our eyes met across the room. I gave him the slightest, almost imperceptible smile, a silent promise. It was time. And listen, I want to pause here and just say thank you. Thank you for staying with me on this journey. It means a lot. If you're still here, if you're invested in seeing how this ends, just do me a favor and comment the number 1 down below so I know you're still with me. I picked up the pen they put in front of me. I could feel their eyes on me, hungry. I looked over at Leo, who was watching from the doorway, his eyes wide.
I gave him a small, reassuring wink. Then I turned back to my son. Everything's ready, you say? Just sign where I mark, Dad, Kevin said, his focus entirely on the papers, his voice tight with anticipation. He was so close he could taste it. We'll make it painless, Tiffany chimed in again, her smile unwavering, a fixture of plastic perfection. I held the expensive pen in my hand. It felt foreign, cold and unbalanced, not like the familiar, worn grip of my own tools. I uncapped it with a soft, deliberate click. The sounds seemed to echo in the silent room, a tiny punctuation mark before the climax. I leaned forward, my shadow falling over the documents. Their documents. The instruments of my surrender. The final chapter of their long, ugly campaign. I could feel their collective breath being held, their bodies tensed, waiting for the stroke of the pen that would make them rich.
And then I did something they didn't expect. I didn't sign their papers. I didn't even touch their papers. I reached under the dining room table, where my own envelope had been resting on my lap, hidden from view. It was a simple, heavy, cream-colored envelope. Nothing fancy. But on the back, sealed in dark red wax, was the official embossed stamp of Jenkins Law, LLC. I placed it on the table with a soft, definitive thud. It landed right next to their manila folder, a stark contrast of quiet dignity against their cheap ambition. Kevin frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What's this, Dad?" "My version of ready," I said. My voice was no longer frail. It was no longer the voice of a tired old man. It was calm. It was steady. It was the voice of a man who knows the grain of the wood and exactly where to make the cut. His eyes darted from my envelope to my face and back again, confusion clouding his features. Tiffany's smile faltered for the first time that night, a tiny crack appearing in the flawless facade. With a hesitant hand, Kevin reached out and picked up my envelope. It had a weight to it, a substance that their flimsy papers lacked. The weight of truth. He fumbled with the wax seal, breaking it with a small crackle. He pulled out the documents inside, thick, high-quality paper, bound with a simple, sturdy metal clip. He began to read the first page. I watched him. I didn't say a single word. I just watched. I watched as his lips moved silently, forming the legal terms he didn't understand. I watched as the confident smirk he'd been wearing all night slowly slid off his face like a mask melting away. I watched as the color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty grayish pallor. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror. It was the look of a man who had been confidently striding toward a finish line, only to find it was the edge of a cliff. He was falling, and he didn't know where he was going to land. Tiffany, ever impatient, snatched the papers from his trembling hand. Her eyes, sharp and quick, scanned the document, her lips a thin, hard line. I watched her spine stiffen, her posture becoming rigid, as if she'd been struck by a cattle prod. She looked up at me, her plastic smile gone, shattered into a million pieces. In its place was a mask of pure, unfiltered disbelief and rising fury. What is this?" she stammered, the words catching in her throat, strangled by the sudden, shocking realization that the game was not just over, but that they had been checkmated from the very first move. I leaned back in my chair, the old oak groaning softly under my weight. It was the only sound in the room for a long moment. For the first time all night, for the first time in months, I felt completely at ease. The performance was over. The trap had been sprung. "That," I said, my voice filling the heavy silence, "is fairness." What they were holding, what they were staring at with such horrified disbelief, was a notarized, certified copy of the Arthur Miller Irrevocable Living Trust. The first page was a summary written in plain, simple English by Sarah specifically for this moment. It outlined the trust's core function,
that all my significant assets, the house they were sitting in, the investment portfolio they were drooling over, the savings I had bled for, were legally owned by the trust. And that I, Arthur Miller, was the sole trustee with absolute and total control. Their power of attorney forms, the ones sitting on the table like a bad joke, were utterly and completely useless. Trying to use them to access the trust's assets would be like trying to open a bank vault with a library card. Kevin finally found his voice. It was a hoarse, strangled whisper. You went to a lawyer? You did this behind our backs?" "No, son," I corrected him gently. My voice was calm and even. "I did it right in front of you. You just weren't looking. You were too busy counting my money to see what I was actually doing." Tiffany kept reading, her face getting paler with every line, her knuckles white where she gripped the paper. She reached the second page, the one with the poison pill. "The fiduciary interference clause." Her finger traced the words as she read them out loud, her voice a monotone of shock. "Any attempt by any named beneficiary to challenge the trust, gain control of assets through coercion, legal maneuvering, or by having the trustee declared incapacitated will result in the immediate, automatic, and permanent disinheritance of that beneficiary." I knew the exact moment she understood the full, devastating scope of it. Her breath hitched. Her eyes darted from the page in her hand to the manila envelope she had brought, the one containing the power of attorney forms. Then back to the page. The trap was not only visible to her now, she could feel its cold steel jaws clamped firmly on her leg. Their very act of bringing those papers here tonight, of trying to get me to sign them, was the attempt that triggered the clause. They had disinherited themselves. They didn't yell. They didn't argue. The fight had got out of them, replaced by the cold, heavy shock of total and absolute defeat. They had spent months scheming, building their perfect, clever plan, only to find that I had built a fortress while they were sharpening their knives. They had walked into my house with pens and smiles and a sense of entitlement as big as the sky, expecting to walk out with my life savings. Now they were realizing they would be lucky to walk out with their dignity. They left without saying another word. They just stood up, their movements stiff and robotic, and walked out. They didn't even close the door fully, letting the cold November air sweep into the room, a fitting ending to the evening. They came with a plan. They left with a lesson. And that night, for the first time in years, I slept without locking my bedroom door. What was there left to steal? I knew them well enough to know that surrender wasn't in their nature. Defeat, maybe, but not surrender. A cornered animal is a dangerous one, and I knew they'd thrash and bite before accepting their fate. The week that followed the disastrous confrontation was silent, but it was a tense, coiled silence, like the air before a lightning strike. I expected a call, an angry, screaming outburst, maybe even a tearful fake apology. I got none of that. Instead, they tried to be clever. They tried to find a back door to the fortress they couldn't breach. The first attempt came on a Thursday afternoon. My phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number with a local area code. A cheerful, professional woman's voice was on the other end. "Hello, is this Mr. Arthur Miller?" "Yes, it is." "Wonderful. This is Brenda from Midwest Fidelity. I'm just calling to follow up on a transfer request that was initiated on your retirement account this morning. We just need your final verbal confirmation to proceed with moving the funds to the new family management account."
My blood ran cold, but I kept my voice perfectly calm. They were trying to bypass me, using the account information they had to impersonate me or authorize transfers as my concerned son. "Brenda," I said, my voice polite but firm, "I have made no such request. My accounts are not to be touched by anyone. Please make a detailed note in my file that any further requests of this nature from anyone other than myself, in person with 2 forms of photo identification, are to be considered fraudulent and reported to the authorities. Do you understand?" There was a moment of surprised silence on the other end.
then a flustered, "Oh, yes, of course, Mr. Miller. I'm so sorry, there must have been some confusion on our end." She hung up quickly. 2 days later, another call, this time from a man claiming to be from my local bank, asking to verify a power of attorney document they had just received and needed to put on file. I gave him the same speech, almost word for word. After each call, I did two things. First, I called Sarah, my lawyer. For each attempt, she sent a sharp, formal cease and desist letter to the financial institution's legal department, referencing the irrevocable trust and warning them of their immense liability if they allowed any unauthorized access. Second, I started a log. I wrote down the date, the time, the company, and the nature of the fraudulent attempt. I was building my own paper trail now. They were clawing at the walls of the fortress, looking for a loose stone, a crack in the mortar. But we had built it too well. Each attempt was not only a failure, it was another nail in their own coffin, another piece of evidence of their malicious intent that Sarah could use if they ever became foolish enough to take this to court. It was pathetic, really. A series of desperate echoes in a chamber that was now soundproof. They didn't seem to understand that the game was over. They had lost. They just hadn't accepted it yet. But I knew I needed to make one final move. Not a defensive one. A final, decisive, offensive move to end it for good. A move not just for me, but for Leo. My last visit to Sarah Jenkins' office was different from all the others. It wasn't about defense. It wasn't about building walls or setting traps. It was about the future. My future on this earth was limited. I'm a realist, not a fool. But my legacy, that was something I could still shape, something I could still protect and direct long after I was gone. "They won't stop, Sarah," I told her, sitting across from her desk, the log of fraudulent calls in my hand. "They'll wait. They'll wait until I'm gone, and then they'll try to challenge everything. They'll try to paint me as a confused, senile old man who was manipulated by my lawyer. They'll try to break the trust." "They can try," she said, her voice confident, "but they won't succeed. The trust is ironclad. And now, with this log of theirs," she tapped the papers, "they've made it even stronger. They've proven their own malicious intent." "I know. But I want to make it a matter of principle. I want to send one final message. I want to change my will." And so we did. My previous will, written years ago when I was still naive enough to believe in the goodness of my own son, had split my remaining personal assets, things outside the trust, like my tools, my truck, my personal effects, evenly between Kevin and Leo. We tore it up. Figuratively, of course. Sarah drafted a new one. The new will was simple, direct, and brutal in its clarity. It explicitly stated that due to his actions, which I briefly but clearly outlined, my son Kevin Miller was to be disinherited. His wife, Tiffany Miller, was also named and disinherited. To make it legally airtight, so they couldn't come back later and claim they were accidentally forgotten or overlooked, I bequeathed to each of them the sum of $1. One single dollar to be paid from my estate. It was a legal formality, but it was also a symbol. It was the final valuation I placed on their loyalty and their love. The entirety of my remaining estate, every tool in my workshop, every book on my shelf, every photograph in my albums, every dollar left to my name was to go directly to the trust I had already established. And the sole beneficiary of that trust upon my passing was my grandson, Leo Miller. That weekend, I called Leo over to the workshop. I presented him with a small, heavy box I had made from black walnut, the same beautiful dark wood I was working on the night he came to me with his warning. It was smooth and dark, with intricate dovetail joints and a simple brass lock. "This is for you," I told him. "Inside is a letter from me and some very important papers. I want you to keep it safe, and I want you to promise me that you won't open it until you turn 25. Can you promise me that?" He held the box with both hands, his eyes serious and wide. He promised. Inside that box, along with the long letter explaining my love for him and the reasons for my difficult choices, was a certified copy of the trust and my new will. I was giving him the blueprints to his future, a future built on truth, not on lies. He looked at the box, then back at me, a question in his eyes. "What about Mom and Dad?" he asked, quietly, his voice filled with a child's confusion and a sadness that broke my heart. I put my hand on his shoulder. "They chose their path, Leo," I said softly. "And sometimes the hardest lesson in life is learning to let people walk it." The months that followed were quiet. The silence from Kevin and Tiffany was absolute, a void where a relationship used to be. There were no calls, no texts, no birthday card for my 73rd birthday, no call on Christmas morning. It was as if a diseased limb had been amputated. The initial sharp pain was gone, replaced with a clean, peaceful emptiness. It didn't hurt. It felt healthy. It felt like healing. It felt like healing. Leo still came over every Saturday. We'd play chess on the porch in the summer and build model airplanes in the workshop in the winter. He never mentioned the box, and he never mentioned his parents' absence. It was like he was a kid again, and I was just his grandpa. It was the best medicine I could have asked for. I almost thought it was over, that they had finally accepted their defeat and moved on. I should have known better. Greed has a long memory. One morning in early spring, the mailman delivered a certified letter. It was from a high-powered law firm in Miss City I didn't recognize. My hands were steady as I signed for it. I was past the point of being shaken.
Inside was a formal, multi-page letter written in the kind of dense, intimidating legalese designed to make an ordinary person's head spin. It was from a new lawyer Kevin and Tiffany had hired. The letter was a masterpiece of cold, corporate doublespeak. It talked about reestablishing familial harmony, exploring options for joint estate management, and the mutual benefits of reviewing outdated legal structures for the good of the entire family. It was a formal request for a four-way meeting, me, Kevin, Tiffany, and our respective lawyers, to discuss the dissolution of the current trust and create a more inclusive and equitable financial plan moving forward. There was not one word of apology, not a hint of remorse, no admission of wrongdoing, just a brazen, arrogant attempt to pretend the last 6 months hadn't happened. They were trying to use legal intimidation to get what they had failed to get through trickery and deceit. They were trying to drag me into a war of attrition, hoping an old man would buckle under the pressure and the potential expense of a protracted legal battle. They misjudged me. Again. I didn't even bother to read the whole thing. I picked up the phone and called Sarah. I read her the first paragraph. I heard her laugh on the other end of the line. It was not a happy laugh. It was a sharp, dismissive bark, the sound of a predator who has just seen its prey walk into a trap of its own making. "Leave it to me, Art," she said. "You won't be hearing from them again." I didn't reply to their lawyer. Sarah did. Her response was, from what she told me, one of the shortest and most effective letters she had ever written. It contained no greetings and no pleasantries. It was a single photocopied page from my trust document, the page containing the fiduciary interference clause, the poison pill. She had taken a bright red pen and circled the entire section. At the bottom of the page, she had written one single sentence in bold black ink. "Per the enclosed, your letter itself constitutes a legal challenge and has triggered this clause. Any further communication on this matter will be considered harassment and will be treated as such." That was the last time I ever heard from my son about money. And you'd think that would bring me a deep sense of satisfaction, but it didn't. Because this was never about revenge. This was about peace. And finally, after a year of turmoil and heartache, I had it. The quiet in my house was no longer tense or heavy with unspoken things. It was calm. It was my own. The Saturdays with Leo were no longer a refuge from a storm. They were just Saturdays. beautiful, ordinary, peaceful Saturdays, filled with the smell of sawdust and the sound of a young boy's laughter. One afternoon, late in the summer, we were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, turning the Ohio sky into a symphony of orange, pink, and deep purple. He was older now, on the cusp of understanding the complexities of the world. He looked over at me from the porch swing, his feet just brushing the wooden planks. "I'm glad you didn't let them take it, Grandpa," he said, out of the blue, his voice quiet but clear. "You worked too hard." My eyes burned, but I smiled, a real smile that reached all the way to my heart. "It was never about the things, Leo," I told him, my voice a little thick with emotion. "The house, the money in the bank, that's just lumber and paper. It can all be replaced. What they were trying to take was the story of every hour I spent in that steel mill, every splinter I got in the workshop, every sacrifice my grandma and I made. They wanted to tear down the house just to sell the bricks. They forgot that the real value was in the living that happened inside it, the love that held it together." I looked out at the fading light, at the fireflies beginning to blink in the twilight. "Your inheritance, Leo," I continued, "isn't in a bank account. It's in that walnut box I gave you. It's the story of why it's yours. I didn't give it to you just because you share my blood. I gave it to you because you share my values. Because on a night when the adults in your life were planning a lie, a little boy was brave enough to tell the truth. That's a legacy worth more than all the money in the world." They tried to erase the man who spent a lifetime building something honest with his own two hands. They saw an old man in a chair and assumed he was weak. They forgot one simple thing. The man who builds the house knows where all the support beams are. He knows its strengths, its weaknesses. He knows how to make it stand forever. Revenge isn't always loud. It isn't a fiery explosion of anger. Sometimes it's the quiet, satisfying click of a well-laid plan falling perfectly into place. It's the silence that follows when your opponents realize they have been completely and utterly outplayed. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply peace. If my story resonated with you, if you believe that a legacy must be earned, not taken, then please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It really does help stories like this find the people who need to hear them. And finally, I want to ask you to share your own wisdom. Tell me in the comments below, have you ever had to draw a line in the sand to protect what you've built or who you love? What's one piece of advice you'd give to someone facing a difficult family situation? Because around here, we don't just tell stories. We share the wisdom we've earned along the way. Thank you for listening.